the latest in tech and accessibility. This is Access Tech Live with Stephen Scott and Marc Aflalo.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Access Tech Live. I am Stephen Scott. Marc Aflalo is with me as always. Now, November is Diabetes Awareness Month. Now, according to research, diabetes is the third largest cause of blindness worldwide. Yet the devices used to treat the disease are widely inaccessible. Now, Derek Lackey is an accessibility advocate who lost his eyesight due to complications with type 1 diabetes. He launched a campaign to petition Health Canada to help narrow the divide between treatment tools and accessibility. Derek, welcome to Access Tech Live.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Now, Derek, you lost your sight, as I say, in 2013, nearly 10 years after you were diagnosed with diabetes. What kind of treatment plan were you on at the time for your diabetes?
Actually, I was diagnosed in 1994, so it's like almost 20 years after I had lost my eyesight. And, at that point in time, it was injections and, finger sticks, taking your glucose readings through the meter. And it wasn't until early 2000 and 2001 that I received my first insulin pump and began pump therapy rather than injections. But I was still using the finger sticks to monitor my glucose levels.
Did you, Derek, have an advantage, you think, in your treatment because, you used tools like glucose monitoring while you were still sighted?
I wouldn't necessarily call it an advantage because definitely once I had lost my eyesight in 2013, it really became a struggle to monitor those glucose levels. Trying to use the finger sticks to monitor those levels was extremely exhausting and stressful, not knowing if you had enough blood or if you had gotten enough blood into the test strip, making sure that you could get it every single time. You could end up going through 5 or 6 test strips at a time, which kind of defeated the purpose of purchasing, your supplies based on monthly standard, because now there was this extra level of hindrance that you had to deal with that made it much more hard to deal with.
Derek, diabetes is one of these things that the technology has actually played a pretty significant positive role on, I think, when you think about, the app-controlled devices like Freestyle Libre and the various companies that make this continuous glucose monitoring. Is that the same when it comes to things like the insulin pumps themselves?
No, the insulin pumps themselves are very archaic in a sense, as it's been well over 20 years ago that the National Federation for the Blind and the American Foundation for the Blind actually did a research project on not only your glucose monitoring equipment as well as the insulin pump therapies. And it's been over 20 years, and we've seen that there's still no progress made in making any kind of accessibility movement forward, in a sense, when it comes to insulin pump therapy, other than the newest integration of maybe adding an iPhone or Android application to be able to communicate to the insulin pump itself to find out at least your basics of your current basal rate, the number of units you have on board, and battery levels and reservoir levels.
It's interesting to hear you talk about this, Derek, because I've had a lot of people get in touch with me on my Double Tap show having issues with this. Being blind themselves, having issues using these devices, getting access to them. Is this the reason you decided to start this campaign?
Well, it's definitely the reason I jumped on board, is because now, I lived so much of my life as a sighted individual and suddenly found myself in this entirely new world and still dealing with this same monster, so to speak, that diabetes as a disease is. Because really it affects everyone. And it's like a secondary life. It's not even a job, because a job, you work your daily hours, your weekly hours, and eventually you retire. Whereas this is like a second life that you have to live with another part of your life. It just never goes away, and it's 24/7, 365 all the time. So finding myself now dealing with how do I monitor my glucose levels when I'm going through so many test strips and so many Lancets, and it's costing exponentially more number of dollars every month to try and monitor accurately. And the old days of 3 times a day monitoring your glucose levels was a thing of the past, and now 6 times or more a day was much more the common norm. So it really became, how do I look at what is available and how do I, make it known and become a voice and express my discontent with where our management and overall access to these life-changing therapies are for us in this today.
Derek, I think of medical equipment manufacturers almost like big pharma, where we know they're in it, for the profit at the end of the day, while they're still providing, a service that we need and trying to help us. Why do you think there's such a divide between these manufacturers? And I know they're not all the same. And treatment for diabetes, and accessibility of that treatment. Why do you think there's such a separation there?
I'm not sure, because we look back at the iPhone coming in with voiceover back in the early 2000s and bringing that access and that technology forward, and knowing that there's these manufacturers of medical equipment that have fallen so far into the past. It's almost baffling to understand, like, why has this not become just an integrated part of our daily access and technology? It's becoming so mainstream when it comes to smart speakers, the phones, televisions, appliances. Everything is becoming so advanced with the smart technology. Yet here's our medical industry falling behind, and slowly but surely, our continuous glucose monitoring systems have really kind of jumped in leaps and bounds forward, and becoming more accessible for us as blind users. But yet other facets like insulin injections, pens, and pump therapies are so far behind. It's just inconceivable to think that 8% of the global population of this planet identifies as having some kind of effect with diabetes, and yet we have completely just turned a very large blind eye, so to speak, on that population.
Yeah, and especially as blindness is so intrinsically linked with diabetes as well, right? So this campaign has been going for a while. What has the response been to your efforts? Have you had response from these companies?
Well, like I said, when it comes to CGM systems, there are various companies out there. I've used several of them. I'm currently using the Dexcom G7 myself, which is, if you can see this little device here, for those who are sighted, it's this tiny little device that's even 60% smaller than its predecessor, the G6. But they have been an absolutely phenomenal company to deal with in creating full autonomy when it has come to dealing with my glucose levels and creating a more autonomous lifestyle when it comes to dealing with your diabetes. Now, when it comes to the pump companies themselves, we have received good feedback from the 4 manufacturers here in Canada, and we have several of them on board, joining forces with the AFB, the NFB, CNIB, as well as Diabetes Canada, in looking to the World Health Organization to make it known and make it a goal in the future to move towards a more accessible insulin pump and manufacturing that which is needed for this very large portion of the population that's, so to speak, been left in the dust.
Yeah, Derek, you and I talked off the air preparing for this. I said we're gonna follow up in a couple of months, have you back on the show, and try to get some of these companies on board as well to have a conversation about accessibility on their devices. So we will definitely follow up with you in a couple of months and do that. Before we let you go, Derek, I got to ask you the question of the day. If you were to tell somebody one thing about your disability, what would that be?
The biggest thing I'd have to say about not only my blindness, but my diabetes as well, because diabetes, in a sense, can be a disability. They're both invisible. I mean, I very often or not have been accused of not being blind or not having any problems because you can't physically see it on the outside. It's not a very visible disease or a visible disability. And it's really unfortunate because like David said before, we don't all share the exact same issues, and everyone's looking for, someone that looks like, you know, um, uh, Ray Charles or, Stevie Wonder, expecting me to be wearing my black glasses, waving my head around and talking real funny, or being a musician. And that's really not the case. And it's such a stereotype. It really is discouraging when people just have such a lack of knowledge when it just comes to diseases as a general.
Yeah, and it's so funny you say those particular examples, because there are a lot of us who say we don't want to look disabled, but some of us don't know what that means either. We're told we don't look disabled, and still to this day don't really understand what that means. Derek Lackey, it's been really interesting talking to you. Thank you so much for sharing your views on this. And these conversations are important, so thank you for coming on to Access Tech Live.
I'd like to thank you and Marc as well for bringing light to this subject and making it known and bringing it out publicly, because it's something that really needs to change in today's day and age.
Thanks, Derek. Coming up, the Tripping on Air podcast annual gift guide and giveaway is on now. Lots of really cool tech items are up for grabs. The host of that show and TV series Fashion Disc that you can find on AMI Plus, Arja Shepard, joins us next to highlight some of those ideas. This is Access Tech Live. Stephen, I will learn how to speak, I promise.
We want to hear from you. Follow us on social media and get involved at Access Tech Live. We'll be right back.